Florida was part of Spanish territory from 1513 to 1763, when it was transferred to Britain after the French and Indian War. It became Spanish territory again from 1783 until 1821, when Florida became a United States territory. Florida's population was sparse during its entire time as Spanish and British territories. The British occupation saw a rise in population, but it was short-lived. Most of the residents of Florida lived in and around St. Augustine on the east coast and Pensacola in the west. There were other small towns dotted along the King's Road, small forts as well as missions. The interior of Florida had very little European settlers. This was the home of the Seminole people. There were a few plantations along the St. Johns River, and steamboat travel was well established along the St. Johns and Apalachicola rivers. By the 1830s, travel through the interior was very difficult and dangerous. Settlers entering the interior of Florida were faced with the Seminole people. 3 wars were fought to remove the Seminoles, but a small band of a few hundred survived in the Florida Everglades. These wars lasted until the 1850s, which slowed development of the interior of Florida. Florida's population in 1840 had reached 54,477 people. Slaves made up nearly half of that number. Florida became a state on March 3, 1845. Its population had reached 66,500. Around 30,000 of those people were enslaved. After statehood, the population started to boom. By 1860, the population had increased to 140,000, 77,000 white settlers, and 63,000 enslaved. Forced labor accounted for 85% of the state's cotton production, with the majority of plantations being concentrated in Middle Florida, with the epicenter in Leon County. Plantations trickled down into Central Florida. The further south, the few in number. South Florida was largely unpopulated besides Key West. Tensions were rising in the South ahead of the 1860 election. In January 1860, talk of war led Senator Stephen Mallory and David Levy Ewell to request munitions and equipment for Florida forts. Governor Perry sent a message to the state legislature on November 27, 1860, asking for $100,000 in funding for the state military. During the 1860 presidential election, Southern Democrats walked out of the Democratic National Convention. They nominated John C. Breckinridge to run for their party. Abraham Lincoln won the 1860 presidential election, but Breckinridge won the vote in Florida. A few days after the election, a large group of pioneers headed to Ocala, Florida, and demanded secession. A special secession convention was called by Governor Perry to discuss secession from the Union. Delegates met on January 3, 1861 in Tallahassee. 51 of the 69 convention members held slaves, and just 7 were Florida natives. On January 7th, the vote was a landslide in favor of secession, 62 for and 7 against. Florida officially seceded from the Union on January 10, 1861, becoming the 3rd state to leave the Union after South Carolina and Mississippi. Then came Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, Texas, Virginia, Arkansas, North Carolina, and Tennessee. The American Civil War officially began on April 12, 1861, when Confederate troops bombarded Fort Sumter in Charleston, South Carolina. President Lincoln declared the seceding states in rebellion and called for 75,000 troops on April 15, 1861. Florida played a different role in the war than many other states in rebellion. Florida was a young state and did not have a large population. Florida had the second smallest white population out of any state north or south, at 77,749. Nearly half of Florida's population was enslaved. They numbered 61,753. Florida would play the role as the breadbasket of the Confederacy. Florida served as a major supplier of cattle, pork, and salt. They supplied around 75,000 head of cattle to armies across the South. Florida cattle was so important that a special militia was established to protect Florida cattle from Union raids, known by the nickname the Cow Cavalry. They were the first Florida Battalion Special Cavalry. Salt was another huge commodity during the war, supplied by salt works across Florida's massive coastline. Salt water was boiled in large kettles, evaporating the water and leaving the salt behind. Before the times of refrigeration and mass-produced canned foods, salt was the primary method for preserving meats. The armies required large amounts of salt to preserve beef and pork, the Army's primary food source. Florida produced around 15,000 troops for the Confederacy. Most of these soldiers were sent north, fighting in the eastern or western theaters. Around 2,000 Floridians fought for the Union. Florida's population was so small that every border state except for Delaware produced more soldiers for the Confederacy than Florida. Florida had a number of Home Guard units as well as the 2nd Florida Cavalry Regiment, 5th Florida Cavalry Battalion, 1st Florida Militia, cadets from the West Florida Seminary, Cow Cavalry, and numerous companies, artillery batteries, and reserve units that protected the state during the war. Florida saw numerous campaigns and raids during the war. The Battle of Olustee was Florida's only major battle during the war. Over 10,000 troops met on the field of battle, including the famous 54th Massachusetts Infantry Regiment. They guarded the rear during the Union retreat, keeping the Army intact. The battle was a decisive Confederate victory. The Union were pushed back to Jacksonville. They failed to cut off Confederate supply lines. In the 1820s and 30s, the St. Marks River had numerous vital port towns that shipped cotton from the Red Hills region of Florida and Georgia. The St. Marks Lighthouse was built in 1831, but was damaged from erosion. It was rebuilt in 1842 farther inland. During the Civil War, the lens of the light was removed to prevent use by Union blockade ships. Confederate troops were stationed near the lighthouse during the war to prevent Union landings and raiding parties. In March of 1865, a fleet of 16 Federal Navy ships carrying around 1,000 men entered Appalachia Bay and shelled the area around the lighthouse in preparation for a landing party. Confederate troops set fire to the interior of the tower, but the lighthouse was not destroyed. On March 4th, around 1,000 Union troops landed near St. Mark's Lighthouse. On March 5th at 8 a.m., the men marched towards the East River Bridge, southeast of the abandoned river town of Port Leon. Around 60 men under the command of Confederate Lieutenant Colonel George Washington Scott guarded the bridge with one 12-pounder artillery piece. As the Federals approached, Scott ordered his men not to fire from a distance, but to wait until they were close. They fired one canister shot at the Federals. After a small skirmish, the Confederates retreated, leaving the artillery piece behind. The main federal force arrived at the bridge under Brigadier General John Newton and continued marching towards the town of Newport. Lieutenant Colonel Scott reached Newport before the Federals. He ordered his men to dismantle the bridge and burn the buildings on the east side of town, but only part of the bridge was dismantled. He was reinforced with home guard, sailors, and artillerymen. His forces numbered 100 men. As the Federals approached around 5 p.m., heavy fire rained down from the entrenched Confederates. The Federals attempted to shell their positions, but failed to overrun the bridge by nightfall. General Newton decided to attempt a crossing at Natural Bridge, 8 miles upriver. He left around 400 men behind at Newport to prevent the rebels from following. Natural Bridge is a place where the St. Marks River flows underground through a series of sinkholes for a quarter mile and then back out the other side. Rebel scouts spotted the Federal movements. Reinforcements were sent from Tallahassee. The Confederates reached Natural Bridge first. The Federals arrived before daylight on March 6th and came under fire from Confederate muskets. The Federals' first attempt to take the bridge failed. They attacked again and again and were pushed back by the rebels. Confederate reinforcements continued to arrive, raising the Confederate numbers to 1,000 men. They outnumbered the Federals in both men and artillery. The rebels dug in and entrenched their positions. The Federals tried to outflank the rebels, but the only place not a bog or a marsh was already defended. The Federals built their own earthworks. They tried to outflank the rebels again, but failed to reach the rebel lines. Now the Confederates attacked the Federal positions, but the Federals dug in and were protected by artillery. They were pushed back after multiple attempts. The Federals were running low on ammunition and outnumbered. They began their retreat to the St. Mark's Lighthouse. Unfortunately, numerous Federals were forgotten during the retreat, stationed at other crossings from earlier engagements. 4 men were captured at Newport, including 2 men, Corporal Asia Fowler and Private Peter Pelt of the 2nd Florida U.S. Cavalry. They were Confederate deserters of the 2nd Florida Cavalry Regiment. Some of their old regiment recognized them. They were charged with desertion and sentenced to death. The 2 men were executed by firing squad and buried in a shallow grave. Union losses in the battle were 21 killed, 89 wounded, and 38 captured. Confederate losses were far less, 3 killed, 23 wounded. Most of the casualties were in the final Confederate attack. The Battle of Natural Bridge was one of the last significant Confederate victories of the war. General Robert E. Lee surrendered a month later on April 9th at Appomattox Courthouse. The Battle of Palmetto Ranch on May 12th and 13th was the final land battle of the Civil War. It ended in a Confederate victory. Florida played a unique role in the American Civil War, and it is often overshadowed by larger battles to the north. Florida has plenty of Civil War history, and it should always be remembered. I want to thank you all for watching, folks. I hope you enjoyed, and we will see you on the next. Peace.